of all, let me just say how nice it is to see such a nice group of people here this morning. As you know, it's been a very quiet, sleepy week in Ottawa. We thought we would liven things up with what promises to be a very stimulating conversation brought to you by Big Thinking. My name is Gabriel Miller. I'm the Executive Director of the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences. Across Canada, we represent 160 universities and scholarly associations and a community of 90,000 scholars and graduate students. To begin, I want to acknowledge the Algonquin Nation, whose traditional and unceded territory we are gathered upon today. We're grateful to be able to gather and exchange ideas on this land. This morning's talk will take place in English with simultaneous interpretation available via cell phone. Si vous avez besoin d'interprétation simultanée, les détails se trouvent sur vos tables. Nous avons aussi beaucoup d'écouteurs à l'inscription. Je souhaite remercier l'honorable Greg Fergus, notre député parrain de la série. C'est grâce à M. Fergus que ces événements peuvent se tenir dans ce magnifique édifice. Of course, I want to especially make a point of thanking our dear friends and partners at SSHRC, represented by, among others today, their Executive Vice President, Brent Herbert Copley today. It is only with the support of SSHRC that we are able to continue to hold the Big Thinking series and bring thinkers and researchers from across Canada to the nation's capital to share insights with policymakers, government, and other partners here in the city. About the agenda today. Today's discussion is a call to action for all of us to think about the role of the international community in supporting refugees and internationally displaced people. In a moment, we will have a proper introduction for our keynote, Mr. Rock, who will deliver a presentation based on a just released report by the World Refugee Council. Following Mr. Rock's keynote, we will invite our very special guest interviewer, Ms. Heather Scoffield, to join him for a conversation, and then to take questions from the audience. And I'm sure as many of you know, Heather is, until today, the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Canadian Press. And next week, she begins a new job with the Toronto Star as a national columnist. And I, for one, am very excited to see what she's going to be saying in that new job. To get things kicked off this morning, I want to invite another special guest up to make our introductions officially. You may know him as Canada's first parliamentary budget officer, or you may know him as the founding president and CEO of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. Following a 27-year career in the public service, Mr. Kevin Page now engages with university students and researchers on a daily basis as he and his team push the boundaries of fiscal and political analysis. Mr. Page is a globally recognized authority on fiscal matters, and having him here today is a symbol of how the increased dialogue among society's leading academics and political leaders is of utmost value to us. I hope you'll join me in welcoming Kevin Page.
Thanks, Gabrielle. Special thanks to the Federation for Humanities and Social Sciences and SSHRC as well for making this breakfast possible. And like normally people say, like breakfast should be the most important meal of the day, and I'm pretty sure it will be our most important meal today. And also, I mean, I just want to agree with Gabrielle that I am personally suffering from detox. From detox from news just over the past few days. Just like just yesterday alone, you wake up, you read the newspapers, you know it's going to be a big day in Washington and Ottawa, but you're like reading, and you're like news coming out of Vietnam and with talk about denuclearization, news in the Middle East, talking about bribery and of a prime minister, news in India, Pakistan, where there's skirmishes going on, news in the United Kingdom about maybe another vote on Brexit, and that's how you start your day. And then you turn on the TV at 10 o'clock, and CNN has got every possible pundit lined up. And it gets a roller coaster from there. But then you watch this juxtaposition between Canada and the United States, in the role of oversight. And I got to admit, I was kind of feeling when you step back, feeling a little bit proud of our institutions and just the level of discussion that was taking place. And but again, and I'm also very thankful for Shirk and for the Federation for helping me with this detox, because this conversation that we're going to have today is just so incredibly important. And you can get lost in those personal issues around politics. And having had a chance to read the document, The Call to Action in Transforming our Global Refugee System, it's an amazing document. Also amazing about it is when you kind of look at who puts these documents together, some of the leadership behind it. I was saying to Mr. Rock, I'll just introduce in a very short minute, that for me, it's like looking at the roster of the Montreal Canadiens in the 1970s, where you have names like, Axworthy, Heinbecker, and Rock, and others, they're really leading this incredibly important file. And, I love the way they open. In the foreword, there's a quote from Charles Taylor, which really talks about just where the world is at right now, and how we more than ever, we need to kind of find institutions and leaders that bring people together. And that's why, again, I'm so proud that we have Mr. Rock here today, because he epitomizes bringing people together. For me, Mr. Rock is a bit like a Forrest Gump character, that really, and I mean this, he has a sense of humor, so I can say this, and I mean it in the most, he just seems to be where history is being made, and he seems to know where, he's driven by this higher purpose. And I had a chance to be in his office when he's president of the University of Ottawa. He's now an Emeritus president. But there's pictures of John Lennon and Yoko Ono in his office. And then, but we know the history of this man. He was a trial lawyer up until the early 1990s. He was a cabinet minister in 4 major portfolios. And just add a bit more humor to it, when I left this morning, my wife says, well, what's the rush? Why? I've got a breakfast, and I got to introduce a former Liberal Attorney General. And she goes, what? She says, how come you didn't tell me about this, right? And she's, like myself, an enormous fan for Mr. Rock. But also, he was Canada's ambassador, to the United Nations, and then also an advisor on this very, very good report and this call to action report. So, again, if you're looking for people that are driven by higher purpose, there's no better example than Mr. Allan Rock. And then I think we're also really blessed to have Heather Scoffield here today, to provide this moderation. If I could just sort of jump ahead a little bit to the second part, because I've watched and read Heather Scoffield for a number of years. I won't say how many. That would not be polite, but I also she was, again, this decorated journalist. Everybody who reads economic and fiscal affairs remembers her writings through the 2008 financial crisis. As Gabrielle said, she's now leaving this important post where she did a great job as a bureau chief of CP, Canada Press. And I'm just like Gabrielle, looking forward to reading her columns, because I kind of missed that kind of column, but I'm going to get to read it again. So, and again, this is a lady who started her education in international relations and then went on to journalism. So you could not get a better person to do the moderation part. So thank you very much.
Kevin, thank you for your kind words, your warm introduction. Where were you when I was in politics? That's what I want to know. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming, and may I acknowledge the presence of some members of Parliament who are here, both the House of Commons and the Senate. We're grateful for your being here, for the commitment you've shown to this and to other important issues. But may I also observe that as I walked up the stairs this morning and looked across the street at that magnificent view at the West Block, where the House of Commons now sits, I thought to myself that on balance, I'm just as happy this morning to be on this side of Wellington Street and not that side. But I wish you well, and I'm sure that we'll find a way forward. Kevin said a few words about the council, and let me start by saying I've come here this morning to ask for your help, to make you aware of novel and provocative proposals that deal with one of our major global challenges, to ask you to consider these proposals, to support them if you can, to promote them. This forum is especially important for this purpose because yours are among the most respected and influential voices in our country. The impact of your advocacy would be very considerable. The global challenge of which I speak is, of course, forced displacement. The proposed solutions to which I refer derive from last month's report from the World Refugee Council, an independent body, but one that was created here in Canada, convened by the Centre for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI, in Waterloo, and the executive director of which was Fen Hampson, who is a senior fellow at CIGI as well as Chancellor's Professor at Carleton University. The council was created here, but it is independent, although it was funded in part by the Government of Canada. It derived its funding from a variety of other sources, from here and from outside our country. And its members were drawn from literally around the world. Now, I know that your offices are already filled with impressive reports that line the bookshelves near your chair. So, in the context in which there's no shortage of reports or of wise recommendations, why is this worth the effort? Why is this subject important enough to merit your concern? What's at stake, and what difference can these proposals make? Well, I want to tell you, in my respectful view, why this report deserves your careful attention and ultimately your support. I start with a reference to the quality of the council. The council was 22 persons. I was not a member of the council. I'm an advisor to it, so I can speak unabashedly about the quality of council members. 22 people drawn from 5 continents, including former heads of state, former foreign ministers, senior officials and ambassadors, senior representatives of NGOs and civil society deeply involved in issues of displacement, a winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, a chair of one of the world's biggest foundations, the IKEA Foundation, a young woman who's the African Union Special Envoy for Youth, and I'm very proud to say, among those distinguished members of the Council was Senator Ratna Amadvar, who's here this morning, and who made an enormous contribution to the quality of the Council's deliberations and is now hard at work on implementing some of its key proposals. I think that the value of this report derives as well from the quality of the work done by the Council. Among other things, it commissioned 20 academic studies on specific issues that needed exploration. Leading academics in this country and beyond provided us with reliable and insightful research on some of those issues. Over the 18 months of its work, the Council visited refugees where they live, in camps, in settlements, and in cities in Jordan, Bangladesh, Uganda, Colombia, Ethiopia, Tanzania. It also went to Berlin and to Greece to measure the refugee experience in the EU, to meet with business, with government, with media, and refugees themselves, trying to understand attitudes, challenges, and how they're being overcome. So the work was not done in mahogany-lined boardrooms. It was done on the ground where the issues and the challenges exist. So the quality of the Council the breadth of its work, that's the first reason I offer why you should look carefully at this report. I turn secondly to the sheer scale and significance of forced displacement itself, of the challenges and the grave consequences if we don't manage this right. And by right, I mean humanely. You're all familiar, I think, with the appalling numbers. 68.5 million people forcibly displaced in the world today, the largest number since the Second World War. 40 million of those people are internally displaced, the orphans of the system, without the protection of the 1951 Convention and at the mercy of the country in which they are displaced. 20 million of the 68.5 are refugees within the UNHCR mandate. 5 million are Palestinian refugees in the Middle East. 3.5 million are asylum seekers who've not yet been assigned an official category under the processing that's required. 85% of the total number are located in countries that are described as middle or low income. So these are the developing countries of the world, those least able to meet the financial and other challenges presented by the sudden arrival of mass numbers of displaced persons. 2/3 of the total number live in protracted situations. That is to say, the conflict or the violence, the circumstances that drove them from their homes is of long duration. Wars that last 10, 12, 15 years, displacement that goes on sometimes for decades, if we think of the Palestinians, for example. And for refugees, all of the three traditional ways of resolving their displacement are becoming more difficult. There's voluntary repatriation, or they can go home, and most refugees want to go home. But for the reasons I've just explained, too often they cannot. Local integration is a prospect, but that's become difficult because of the sheer numbers in Europe, because of the economic challenge faced in developing countries, because of the concerns of the domestic population about employment, about changes in culture, about security. So local integration is becoming more difficult. And resettlement to third countries, which is the third potential option, is also hard. The United States has changed its policy toward the acceptance of refugees dramatically. The European Union, well, we needn't elaborate on that. We know the challenges there. So this large number of displaced persons are forced to live on humanitarian aid, which is not nearly enough to meet their needs. To an enormous extent, this is an issue which is gender-based. More than half of refugees and internally displaced persons are women and girls. Half of all refugees are under 18 years of age. So what we have is a group that is vulnerable with particular health concerns, particularly for women in terms of reproductive and maternal health, who are living in circumstances where services that they need are frequently unavailable or underfunded. Most forcibly displaced persons are not in camps, as one might imagine. They're in cities. And that adds to the danger of their becoming invisible, because the delivery of services to them in the urban environment is often more difficult. They often are not allowed to work, and so they become destitute and vulnerable to all of the consequences that arise. There are enormous inequities in funding. Services for refugees are drastically underfunded, and internally displaced persons receive just a fraction of the amount that refugees do. And of course, as we see for ourselves in the daily news, persons escaping conflict or persecution are engaging in ever more risky escapes across oceans and seas in the most difficult of circumstances. And it's only going to get more challenging. because current estimates are that by 2050, there will be 250 million people in the world who are forcibly displaced, largely as a result of climate change, global warming, and its consequences, as people are driven from their homes and their lands. So the scale of the threat, the significance of the challenge is the second reason why I compel this report to you this morning. And even if we're not motivated by altruism, we should think of our own security. How are we going to ensure the security of our own country, the orderly administration of our own government, faced with the pressures that will arise in the decades to come? We need better answers than those that are available at present. The third reason I commend the report to you is that I believe that the proposals that we have put on the table are concrete, they're practicable, and if they're put in place, they will make a real difference. This is not a theoretical report. One might ask, well, just a few months ago, we had a report from the United Nations, the Global Compact. Didn't that provide the answers? Why do we have to go beyond that? Well, in fact, no. The Global Compact was a document produced by intergovernmental negotiations at the United Nations. And as a survivor of that process, I can tell you that it was a months-long race to the bottom, the bare minimum, the irreducible minimum that 193 countries could agree upon. And avowedly, by its own terms, Global Compact is not a political document. They eschewed politics. They had to. And they said, this is just a sort of bureaucratic approach to governing principles in the most general way. The Global Compact did not address fundamental issues like how to fund the global system for forced displacement. The Council was political, not in the partisan sense, but in the sense that we know we need to engage governments to accept changes, whether it's in funding, accountability, or governance, that the 193 countries would never agree upon at the United Nations. You'd never get consensus on the things that are being proposed. And because we need political change, we need governments to maintain confidence and the support of their populations, our starting point in the report was an acknowledgement that every country has the right and obligation to secure its own borders. In other words, we're not recommending that borders be removed and there be a free circulation of anybody who wants to move from country to country. We're acknowledging that in Canada, as elsewhere, the population must feel that our borders are secure, that there's a rules-based system for determining who gets in, and that the rules are respected. But at the same time, we believe that those rules should be humane and effective. And we believe that you can take a lot of pressure off our borders and the borders of other countries by dealing more effectively with displaced persons where they are and where they want to go. And I hope I'll explain that in the course of my brief presentation. So what are we recommending? First of all, that the cornerstone of all of this should be responsibility sharing, and that the responsibility among the nations of the world should be differentiated but common. People can contribute in their own way. It's a bit like the climate change agreement, common but differentiated responsibilities. Not every country has to contribute in the same way. Some might take in refugees, some might give more money, some might engage in new trade arrangements. There are different ways to contribute, but everybody should do their part. The 1951 Refugee Convention, which is invaluable and must be retained, did not speak about responsibility. It did not speak about accountability. It spoke about cooperation, because at the end of the Second World War, as the world turned to the displacement in Europe primarily, the whole approach was based upon cooperation. That was the cornerstone. And so that was the theme of the 1951 convention. A word, cooperation, which is hardly apt for the circumstances in which we find ourselves today. Right now, the burden for displacement is carried by for the most part, the neighboring state to the place of conflict or turmoil, whether it's northern Uganda in the case of South Sudan, Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon in the case of Syria, Myanmar in the case of Bangladesh in the case of Myanmar. But those countries are already struggling. And responsibility is not defined by proximity. That's not fair. And it's not working. We need an independent peer review mechanism to evaluate the contribution made by each country to the shared responsibility for dealing with the human challenge of forced displacement. And that's what the Council recommends. We look at the model being used for the Human Rights Council, universal periodic peer review, and we say that's a good place to start. We suggest a new protocol to the 1951 Convention, spelling out responsibility sharing. We call on interested countries to create a task force to define all elements of responsibility sharing and mechanisms for ensuring that countries do their part. The second thing we propose, which is related, is accountability, which is entirely absent at present from the world refugee system. Everyone's prepared to point fingers at one another, but what we need is rigor in holding people to account. Upstream, there's impunity for political leaders who cause forced displacement through their reckless government or their self-interest in engaging in armed conflict for their own narrow gain. They're not held accountable in their national courts, and the international system at the moment is not functioning to do that. We need more focus on prevention in countries where displacement is in prospect. And we propose also that when corrupt foreign leaders steal money from their treasury and put it on deposit in foreign bank accounts, where that money is frozen because of sanctions or otherwise, the country in which the money is held should confiscate it and put it to use to assist the people displaced through the bad governance by the corrupt leader who stole it. That achieves both accountability and increased funding for the system. And as to accountability downstream, member states who do not contribute to the global system should be held to account, or those who pledge money but don't pay, or those who refuse to accept refugees and participate in resettlement, or those who subject the displaced to inhumane or cruel treatment. Now, it seems to me the 68.5 million number derives from our collective failure to address the causes of displacement, whether it's war, endemic violence, widespread human rights violations, poverty, hunger, corruption. And Canada, like every other country, has a responsibility to introduce accountability by insisting that the Security Council do its job to present and to resolve. Look at the crises that have produced displacement and look at the inaction of the Security Council to do anything about it, whether it's preventive or responsive. And that's their job. They leave it for humanitarian agencies who are not equipped to do it. The third proposal, I know I'm out of time, so I'll speak very quickly about the third and fourth proposals because these go to the heart. The third is money. We're suggesting that there be compulsory assessments for all member states of the UN, as there is for peacekeeping. People must contribute in accordance to the size of their economy. We call upon the Secretary General to start the political process to develop consensus for that change. We also identify innovative means of raising money, including resort to the private sector, the creation of refugee bonds, as there are green bonds in the climate movement, that there be private equity vehicles, which we've explored and on which we have specific recommendations, convening banks and fund managers to find new ways to raise money in capital markets that can be put to use where it's needed on behalf of the displaced. And we call upon the private sector to establish global refugee business coalitions like the Tent Foundation in New York, which is a wonderful example, where businesses commit themselves to using refugees as employees or establishing supply chains that give the displaced an opportunity to participate economically. Just two last points. First, we've got to assist the host countries who have the vast majority, the 85% of the displaced, right now within their borders. They're struggling. In many of those places, the refugees are not allowed to work, which makes things worse. But there are ways to tackle that issue. In Jordan, for example, Senator, you'll recall we learned that there was a lot of pressure on the government of Jordan not to allow the Syrian refugees to have work permits. It was concerned about people losing their jobs. But Jordan negotiated an agreement with the European Union that gave it preferential tariff treatment for its manufactured goods getting into the European market, in exchange for which Jordan agreed to issue work permits to 100,000 refugees, and the industries in which they worked, those products were given preferential tariff treatment in Europe. And it's proved to be a great success, and it's a win-win-win. The economy is growing to that extent. The workers finally have an income of their own, and the markets for Jordan's goods have been expanded. Flexible debt management policies from the World Bank, reallocation by the IMF and the World Bank of funding in regions from the country that caused the displacement over to the country that's hosting those who are displaced. I'll say as well that we have recommendations with respect to internally displaced. There are twice as many internally displaced as there are refugees. They are the orphans of the system. They get 15% of the funding that goes to refugees. There's not been a political solution despite 20, 30 years of chronic challenge in this area. We call upon the UN to create a special representative of the Secretary General responsible for internally displaced persons, to convene a global summit to look for political solutions and how we square sovereignty and respect for it with our collective responsibility to ensure a humane treatment of those who are displaced. Let me close by anticipating your reaction, which is, well, this sounds wonderful, but have another glass of wine. This is just not going to happen. Well, I don't agree. What we're proposing is a global action network for the forcibly displaced. We suggest that it start off as mini multilateralism. We suggest that we pull together the usual suspects, the mid-sized liberal democracies, that we establish a core group of countries, that we bring in NGOs and civil society, the media, the private sector. We make it a broad coalition, a network, so that it's flexible, and it can include people who are needed for specific purposes at particular times, and adjust the distribution of responsibilities among this committed group so we move the whole thing forward incrementally. A network of governments, of refugees themselves, the private sector. We take as our model some Canadian success stories, the Landmines Treaty. In the early 90s, the proposal to do away with anti-personnel landmines was stuck in the UN process that was sclerotic. Canada, among others, used the energy of NGOs and civil society to identify specific objectives, put pressure on governments to come along. We convened a meeting to sign the treaty, and governments had no political choice but to attend and sign because of the force and effect of civil society politically. That's the way you achieve change in this world. And it worked. We started off with 35 or 40 countries signing that treaty. There are now over 140 that have, and the world is better off as a result. Whether it's landmines or responsibility to protect or other important Canadian initiatives, we believe that we can start small, but we can build momentum by getting countries who are already committed to joining this network, to demonstrate the value of these proposals, to support them, to start a political process in the UN and elsewhere to bring about change. And one last word. Having been on those visits with the Council, having spoken to people in host countries as well as refugees, I was struck by the contrast between northern Uganda, say, and Berlin. Why are the attitudes toward the displaced so different? And the best I could do in trying to understand was the difference was empathy. Because in northern Uganda, the government officials who were dealing with 1 million South Sudanese who were arriving, who were given a plot of land and given the right to work and social services in a very progressive and humane approach, But the officials from northern Uganda were saying, you know what, it's our turn. It's our turn, because during the difficult days in Uganda, we all fled to Sudan. And now they're coming here. So it's a long road, and we have to do our part for them as they did it for us. That empathy is found in places where host communities, despite the difficulties, are managing. And you see it sometimes in Canada because of our private sponsorship. The displaced are not a distraction, an abstraction, sorry. They're not an abstraction, they're not theoretical. They're families for whom you help get winter clothes, for whom you help get language lessons. These are individuals that you can see in front of you, and the empathy arises. And that's what we have to work for in trying to implement these recommendations, trying to develop political traction, trying to change the world, to move away from a world with walls and a hardening of hearts, a narrowing of vision, a coarsening of language, and move toward a sharing of responsibility, a recognition of humanity, an acknowledgement of our common responsibility, a generosity of spirit, and a world without walls. I'm sorry to have taken so long, but I really wanted you to hear that. Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry, Heather.
It's quite okay. It's an enormous amount of things to think about. And, you know, you focused mainly internationally. Your plan is clearly international, but I wonder if we can bring it back to Canada a little bit. We are heading into an election. So much of what you talked about there, taking that plan forward, you talked about needing to look at mid-sized liberal democracies. It's a safe zone to take things forward, and Canada has clearly been part of that in the past. You mentioned the landmines treaty and so forth. Are we still in that space? Are we, especially as we head into an election, is that still, do we have an electorate that still wants to, you know, be gentle and incremental and open to finding solutions, or are we heading into a more? I mean, I sense a sharpening of dialogue all around me on a pretty constant basis. We see polling that has opinions ramping up, and intolerance in certain parts of the country as well. So, where are we heading in that?
I can't deny it. I think it's true. But I think what's required is political leadership to summon a solidarity in this country, remind us of our basic values, and bring us around to where we should be on these and other issues. One of the reasons I was anxious to speak to this group, and I described your voices as influential, you're essential participants in this public discussion. People will listen to you. You are impartial. You are insightful. You have a voice that is respected. And I think, Heather, in response to your question, if we have political leadership pointing the way forward and making this case, and we have people in this room making the case in their communities, an evidence-based position, then I think, yes, we can persuade people. You know, fact is that the cornerstone, as I said when I started, is that we have to control our own borders. I understand the anxiety about that. We're not suggesting that the border be put down and there be a free flow of people. We're suggesting a rules-based system. And, by the way, you can reduce the pressure of asylum seekers if you implement these recommendations and treat people humanely where they are and prevent some of the conflicts that cause displacement in the first place. Appealing to self-interest as well as appealing to Canadians' values, I think can get some traction behind these ideas.
So I should have mentioned off the top, I would very much like to involve all of you in this discussion too. So I'll just ask a few questions, but then also pull you into it very soon. So in terms of the academic participation in that discussion, how is that done in a concrete way, in a way that, I mean, it seems to me that if there is intolerance, it's not necessarily at an academic level or even at at a level of discourse among politicians at the decision-making level, but it is a general conversation. How do you actually make that real for people?
Well, I think in many, many ways, writing op-eds, participating in town halls, convening conferences, speaking to the media, any way you can broaden public understanding of these issues, bring facts to the table, base your position on evidence. And you know, the difficult environment that you're describing, Heather, is not new. I remember running for office for the first time in 1993. And in my own riding in Etobicoke Centre, I was not at all known, so I was nominated in May. The election was in October. I went to 30,000 doors during those months. And the second most frequently heard response at the door for me as a political candidate, the first most common was, you have to get rid of that leader, he's yesterday's man, Jean Chrétien. But the second most common was immigration. And we're fed up with these people coming in from all over the world, taking our jobs. We haven't got the money to support ourselves. Why should we be supporting them? That was the second most common complaint at the doors in 1993. So this view of what we have of ourselves is inherently, humane and sympathetic. It's paper thin because at that time we were coming out of a deep recession, there were a lot of economic challenges, and the consequences reflected themselves in attitudes. Then as now, the response is to put the evidence forward and say, you're wrong about that. Immigration's good for this country. And by the way, you're wrong about forced displacement. Here are the facts. Here's what we can do. And it doesn't mean that you have to share your house with somebody from overseas. It means that we're contributing to a global effort in which everybody does their part, and let's get behind this and make it happen.
So, you know, a couple of years ago at the beginning, the early days of the Liberal government, I think there was an awful lot of discussion and even proposals out there from various experts about raising those immigration levels, which in the end, by the time it hit the caucus, that was too much of a difficult argument to make for many, and the numbers were scaled back, and so now it's just a gentle rise in the numbers, and yet we see intolerance rising. And a lot of anxiety. Where does that come from? I mean, why is it that even if politicians are moving very gently, and we saw this with the Conservative Party too, it's not, they also raise the numbers very gently over time, and yet intolerance seems to grow disproportionately.
Well, I think come back to political leadership and the obligation of our political leaders to influence the debate, to remind people of the fundamentals, and having an insightful discussion in society generally. I mean, it sounds a bit Pollyannish, but what else do you do? There is a strong economic case for immigration, and there are needs in the country that are not being met in the workforce that can only be met by bringing in people through the immigration system, and not enough attention is paid to that.
Okay, I'm going to, there's a microphone there and another one there, so if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please go there. I'll while you're getting ready to do that, I have another question for you. Can we talk a little bit about economic anxiety and how much that plays into? I mean, we've seen in the United States there has been, as you mentioned earlier, a change in rules around and a change in acceptance, and also a change in public opinion towards the acceptance of immigrants and refugees. And there has been an awful lot of analysis about whether or not that's linked to economic anxiety and people worried about their jobs. And I think the conclusion has been, well, maybe we can't exactly draw a direct line. What do you see here in Canada? Do you see a direct line between those attitudes and economic anxiety, and where does that head, especially as it seems that the economy is, perhaps we're doing okay now, but maybe not so much in 6 months to a year?
I think there is a line. I think that's what I was seeing in 1993. I think people were concerned about their jobs. Unemployment in 1993, just to remind you, was at 11%. There was that massive deficit, and the only way out looked like raising taxes. People were very anxious about the economy in 1993. And what we found as a council, traveling to these various host communities, is that the anxiety on the part of host communities, especially in Europe, about forcibly displaced arriving, was threefold. First of all, we might lose our job. But second, our culture is going to be impacted. We won't be able to hang on to our traditional culture in this country. And third, for all we know, these people are terrorists, and we're concerned about our security. So those are the three root causes of the anxiety that we found. And in Berlin in particular, we had immensely interesting discussions with people from communities who didn't have these concerns, but were working to meet them, working to reassure people, and to develop the empathy I spoke of. There was one person, an NGO, who organized a kitchen in a big, those big Maersk containers that go on ships. Well, she got funding to take 10 or 12 of these things, cut them open, and put portable kitchens inside. And then she put them on the back of trucks and sent them to communities all around Germany, where there were refugees in the population, and she organized evening meals in those kitchens, inviting refugees and the local population to work together in preparing the meal and then sitting and eating together, and she said it worked magic. So yes, there are those concerns, but there are ways to deal with them, and I think if we look at best practices and what's been done and what works in various places, we can import them here and we can make them happen. And the other thing that makes people anxious is to see those who are not following the rules, and one of the concerns about asylum seekers coming across our border comes from the people in Canada who are themselves immigrants, or refugees who came in through the UNHCR system saying, well, wait a second, I had to wait in line and go through a lot of paperwork. These people are just walking across the border. I resent that. I think we have to explain why that's happening and, again, engender some empathy and some understanding.
Okay, Elizabeth May, let's hear from you.
Thanks, Heather, and hello. I just wanted, because of the conversation you were just having about the notion that intolerance is on the rise, I really think we have to call out and suggest that it's not on the rise. But what's happened is that some very horrific views of the world, essentially racism and white supremacy, had no place in Canada. No one would say it out loud. But between Trump and some domestic politicians, we have given permission and space and oxygen to some things that we thought were long buried. And I think the vast majority of Canadians, and I experience this in my own constituency and when I'm traveling across Canada, people are concerned that others don't want to let refugees come here and welcome them. But that when you look at the specifics of neighborhoods and communities, people are opening their homes, raising money, willing to help. So I think the intolerant attitudes, I think we should call out those politicians who are fueling that for partisan ends. I think it's despicable. I think it should be called out. And I think if we can get the empirical evidence from social science that Canadians are not shifting towards more intolerant racist views, but the small number that were there get a disproportionate amount of publicity. And if they happen to look like yellow vests from France, well, there's an automatic ticket to the evening news. And if somebody funds you to drive a truck to Ottawa, well, okay, you're on the evening news. But let's look at where the vast majority of Canadians are, and we're not an intolerant people. We rest by the vast majority rooted in compassion. That's my view anyway. I could be wrong.
Here, here. And the other thing is, the people who hold those extremist views have a megaphone they've never had before through social media that gives them much more prominence than they would have had theretofore.
Yes, although can you, I mean, to your point, I think, when we saw the whole flood of asylum seekers come across the border, I'd say about a year and a half ago in Cornwall, I sent a reporter down there because we'd heard about l'émeute at the border, and we wanted to see what would actually happen when you have a whole pile of people arriving who look very different than the population of Cornwall, and what would happen there. So we went down to cover that story, and the story we actually covered was the people in Cornwall going into their kitchens and making giant pots of soup and chili and taking it down to the spot where all the refugees were coming in and feeding them, which is lovely. But can you imagine, though, if you go back to the last election in 2015, when there was definitely a turning point in that whole campaign, when we had the picture of of the little boy washing up on the beach, and an outpouring and outcry even to Stephen Harper at the time, saying you're not being compassionate enough, and Justin Trudeau completely embracing that and going for it. could that happen? Are we still there? Or I feel, and our polling shows that would not be able to, we would not be replicating that at this point.
Well, I'd be disappointed if we weren't. I tend to agree with Elizabeth May that, for the most part, Canadians are not extremist in their views on these subjects. And I referred a couple of times to political leadership, which means, in my mind, having our political leaders making the case unabashedly and putting the facts on the table, supported by the academy, supported by those who have the evidence. And I think that can make a real difference.
So, question over there.
Hi, bonjour. Merci beaucoup pour l'accueil chaleureux ce matin. My question is for Mr. Rock. My name is Tiffany Plante. I'm from the Center for International Policy Studies at the University of Ottawa, and I see a lot of my post-secondary colleagues in the room. So I was wondering if you could maybe just also put on your former administrator hat on for a second and give some recommendations what you think post-secondary institutions, both colleges and universities, as we know colleges are often in these small towns, which could use an influx of new blood, as to what they can do to better support refugees in the communities.
Mais bien sûr, c'est une bonne question parce que la responsabilité, comme j'ai déjà constaté, c'est partagé, c'est collectif. Alors, vous avez bien sûr un rôle important à jouer et je commence avec le constat que pour les universités, les gens dans les universités, la recherche, pour exposer les faits, la réalité sur le terrain est très important. Alors, votre rôle, comme j'ai déjà constaté, dans l'effort de clarifier des choses, répondre aux gens qui disent que le Canada est menacé par les réfugiés, par les personnes déplacées de force, donner aux politiciens, donner aux leaders de notre pays le témoignage, la recherche et les faits qui vont nous équiper à répondre à ces questions, à ces défis. Alors ça, c'est numéro un. Apart from that, I think you are the people who will be convening the conferences, who will be speaking out publicly, who will be writing those op-eds, whose voices will be heard as we discuss these issues in the coming campaign. When you see something said that is plainly wrong or inconsistent with what you've uncovered in your research, then say so and find a way to do it, whether it's through SIPs or some other on-campus device which brings people together and attracts the media and gives you a chance to say something that'll be noticed because your voice will be heard, because you're seen as somebody who's above the fray. So I think there are many things that the Academy can do to help research and participation in public discussion first among them.
I would also add, too, in media, there's a huge appetite for understanding and clarifying and explaining, and academics are in a particularly great position to help the media with that, because if they are backed by solid research, especially heading into an election campaign, there is a very big appetite for reporters and journalists generally to look to some credible voices and to lean on you for explanation. Next question.
Hi. I'm a member of an interchurch refugee group which sponsors refugees. We're made up of 5 churches, and we've just now finished a sponsorship as of the last of January of a family. I have to say, I'm the education coordinator, having spent 25 plus years in the educational field, in the K-12 system, the college system, and the university system. We brought in a family who had been on the run for 11 years. This family was made up of 3 adult children. So I can tell you the educational aspects and the employment aspects of this family was very challenging. I don't know where the last year went. It seems like I did not stop, but I did find the institutions and the places for these families to go. I found them very open. My colleagues at the University of Ottawa were more than helpful in trying to assist me in transcripts and whatever else. This family came with no credentials because they had to run. What I did, or what I think is the hard part about all of this, is that there have been many moments of joy, but there's also been moments of despair. What I did find is that there was no one from government who came and said, what are you learning? What do you wish to change? What things are you having difficulty with? So that's my question.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if these people exist somewhere. I guess they do.
Well, some of them are here this morning at breakfast, and they'll be interested to learn from you. I see.
Can I respond?
Yes, Rob Oliphant.
It's Rob Oliphant.
Rob Oliphant. I'm the chair of the Committee on Citizenship and Immigration in the House of Commons, and not a credible spokesperson because I'm obviously not above the fray. I want to explain a little bit about what we do in that committee, because what you've just asked for is exactly what we do. And we've just been engaged in a study on migration, where we actually had the council speak. But we're also engaging, and partway just started a study on settlement services. And that's quite broadly defined about how well we are doing at settling newcomers to Canada, whether they are refugees, asylum seekers, government-sponsored or privately sponsored or blended, as well as immigrants in terms of language, in terms of employment, all those things. So call us. The committee is absolutely wanting to know those stories. But it also pushes us on our migration thing as we look at the council's work, because you start looking at what is the better route? Is the better route, I mean, obviously root causes, especially of forced migration, have to be addressed. Those have to do with violence and war and human rights and totalitarian regimes and all of those things. Then you look at helping the host countries, which is absolutely critical, which I would argue Canada is not doing a good enough job on. That when we were in Uganda in June, and Uganda is one of those countries that is part of the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, they give land to every refugee. They give work permits to every refugee. They give the ability to build a house to every refugee. They don't have camps, they have settlements. Absolutely, Canada should partner there. And those are the kinds of questions that we have to look at. Is most refugees don't want to come to Canada. That's not their goal. Their goal is to be at home. Their goal is to have a successful life with human rights and dignity and economic opportunity and all those things. And that's what Canada's got to do. So the Band-Aid, yes, of refugee, I say we get more out of refugee resettlement than they do, because it makes our country better and more interesting, but we keep doing it. So we are listening. I'm not in government. I'm in Parliament, and it's maybe a good place to be.
Well, that's a pretty terrific answer, Rob. Thank you. And to the woman who put the question, may I say too, first of all, thank you for the enormous contribution you're making. But also, there's a lot of interest around the world in Canada's model of private sponsorship. We're unique in private sponsorship. And my colleague Jennifer Bond from the law school has been asked by Immigration and Citizenship Canada to literally go around the world to 13 countries who've been chosen as potential sites for the expansion of the private sponsorship model, to answer practical questions, to talk about how it could be designed, things we've learned from our own experience. So there's hope that this model might be exported to other countries, which is all to the good.
Okay, we have just time for one last question, and we have to make it quite concise. So, if you go ahead over there. Yeah, we'll have to think.
I don't
densely.
have a concise question, so I'll invite Julie to ask one.
Good morning. I currently work for SURE, but I'm a former settlement worker in schools. So I work with refugees and newcomers in New Brunswick. And when I moved to Ottawa 6 years ago, I tried to work in the settlement because I like working with newcomers and refugees. And I ended up working with citizenship immigration, or DFAID, when I started coming here because we switched. When the Syrian refugees started coming in, I was trained to process their entry. and I also offered to work as settlement for them, and I contacted different departments, and my expertise, trained as a settlement worker in schools, was brushed off, and now they're trying to get sort of support and stuff. But at the time, nobody wanted my help, my volunteer work, because I used to train the schools, I used to train the teachers, I used to train the psychologists, because of what they had gone through in settlement camps. So I'm just wondering, what can we do so that not just the government, but the schools and everybody here in Canada can support them, even when sometimes you have people knocking at the door and they're saying, we don't need your help?
Well, I think that's something that Rob may want. I'm sure he's glad he heard, and maybe your committee will have some recommendations in that regard. I'm not able, from my own experience, to offer any practical advice, but clearly you're a resource that should be put to good use, and what a waste if we don't. But that's sort of a matter of internal Canadian policy, and perhaps the committee can speak to that and make sure we are taking advantage of your expertise. And you know, if I can help in any way, or members of the council like the senator, please let us know.
Okay, thank you so much for, there seems to be an awful lot of goodwill and huge number of very great ideas, and maybe a quest for how to actually turn those things into practice. So thank you for all your contributions on that, and over to you, Gabe.
Yes, thank you indeed for being here this morning. Thank you.
So first of all, let me just thank Mr. Rock, Heather, Kevin Page, the Institute, Helena, for your help in bringing people together today, my staff, led by Sonia Vanni on this event. Je remercie Allan et Kevin et Heather de nous avoir présenté d'aujourd'hui. I also want to thank our sponsors and partners at SHIRC, and again, Greg Fergus, our parliamentary sponsor for these events. Every once in a while, there's a moment in one of these, or a few moments, where you think, oh, right, this is why we do this. And to have Mr. Rock, who I've watched throughout my life and career, lead public discussions, whether it's in health or in justice or in universities and now on refugees, sharing his insights, to have Heather Scoffield make sure that we're not deluding ourselves, as I've seen her do in so many conversations that I've had with her or watched her participate in, ask the tough questions to make sure that we're being honest and really substantive in the commitments and the intentions that we have. But then, of course, to see an exchange like the one we just watched, where a parliamentarian and an important public leader on this issue is engaged in that conversation, bringing the world of universities and academics and research very closely in interaction with the people who have to make decisions and lead the country forward. So what can I say? This is exactly what Big Thinking is about. Merci beaucoup. La prochaine causerie Voix Grand se déroulera en français et mettra en vedette le professeur Vincent Larubière afin d'explorer la thématique des politiques publiques et la diffusion des connaissances à l'ère numérique. Merci encore et bonne journée à tous. Thank you and have a great day.